Chapter 1. The wind howling down from the peaks of Glen Torran did not so much blow as it did collide with the village of Lochduff, shaking the window panes of the police station with the persistence of an angry creditor. Hamish Macbeth, stretched out on his threadbare sofa, was currently engaged in the most strenuous activity of his morning, debating whether to put on his boots or stay tucked under his moth-eaten wool blanket. He had the radio on, tuned low to a crackling broadcast of local weather that promised more of the same grey, miserable deluge, and his dog, Lugs, was curled into a tight, shivering ball at his feet. Life was, for the moment, satisfactorily unremarkable. This, of course, was the exact condition under which the peace of the Highlands was most likely to be shattered. Hamish's reverie was punctuated by the shrill, intrusive ringing of the telephone. He stared at the device as if it were a poisonous viper. Headquarters in Strathbane. It was undoubtedly DCI Blair, who seemed to view Hamish's solitude as a personal insult. Hamish reached out a long, languid arm and unplugged the cord. With a sigh of profound satisfaction, he returned his hands to the warmth of his pockets and drifted back into a state of semi-conscious contemplation. There was a pot of coffee waiting on the stove, and enough leftovers from yesterday's stew to last until lunch, provided he didn't encounter any energetic villagers in need of assistance. His solitude lasted exactly 42 minutes. A sharp, rhythmic hammering at his front door pulled him back to reality. It was not the hurried, frantic knocking of a villager in distress, but the self-important, stake-a-toe pounding of someone who believed their time was significantly more valuable than his own. Hamish groaned, stood up with the heavy dragging gait of a man being marched to the gallows, and opened the door. Standing on the step was a woman of perhaps 50, swathed in a coat of expensive dark green wool that looked entirely capable of repelling the rain. Unlike Hamish's own pathetic, damp uniform, she held a silver-headed walking stick and looked at Hamish with an expression of distaste so clinical it was almost impressive. She was Mrs. Elspeth Sterling, the recent widow of a wealthy financier, who had relocated to a sprawling, isolated estate up the glen. She was, by all accounts, a woman who treated the village of Lochduff like a particularly poorly managed staff retreat. "Constable," she said, not waiting for an invitation to speak, "I assume you have heard the news, or are you, as I have been led to believe, merely a fixture of the furniture?" Hamish blinked, his face settling into an expression of dazed bovine confusion. "Morning to you too, Mrs. Sterling. It's a bit parky, isn't it? Would you like a cup of tea? It's only instant, mind you." "I would like for you to do your job," she retorted, stepping past him into the hallway without waiting for permission. Her eyes scanned the cramped, unkempt space with the weary detachment of an appraiser. "My gardener, a boy named Callum, has seen fit to go missing. His cottage is empty. His tools are abandoned in the mud, and my petunias, which are remarkably delicate at this time of year, have been left completely untended. I expect you to locate him at once." Hamish sighed, his shoulders drooping another inch. "Callum's a good lad, Mrs. Sterling. Maybe he's just taken a few days for himself. The weather's been awful, and the work at your place is a bit on the heavy side." "He is under contract," she said, her voice turning as sharp as the wind outside. "And he is paid quite handsomely to be exactly where he is supposed to be. If he has walked off, I intend to have his references shredded. Now, are you going to get your coat, or must I call your superiors in Strathbane and inform them that their local representative is incapable of basic investigative tasks?" Hamish studied her for a moment, his hazel eyes completely blank, while his mind was already busy pulling apart her arrogance. She was terrified. Beneath the brittle, authoritative shell, there was a tremor in her hands that had nothing to do with the cold. She wasn't worried about her petunias. She was worried about what Callum might have seen or done. He kept his face carefully dull, the kind of face that made people forget he was even in the room. "I'll take a walk up the glen, Mrs. Sterling," Hamish said, his voice slow and thick with feigned lethargy, "though I expect he's just down at the hotel, waiting for the rain to break." "He will not be at the hotel," she said, turning toward the door, her coat swirling around her ankles. "Do not waste my time, Macbeth. I expect an update by sunset." As she marched off into the biting, grey spray, Hamish watched her, his posture straightening the moment she was out of sight. He looked at Lugs, who gave a low, sympathetic woof. She was hiding something, and it wasn't just a missing gardener. The widow of Glen Torran had arrived in Lochdabuff, with a cloud of secrets following her. Hamish had the sinking, familiar sensation that by tomorrow morning, the quiet village would be forced to look at those secrets, whether it wanted to or not. He went to the stove, poured his cold coffee, and felt the familiar, uncomfortable stir of a mystery beginning to wake up. It was going to be a long, wet week. Chapter 2. The morning was not so much breaking as it was reluctantly bruising. The sky above Glen Torran a smear of charcoal and wet slate. Hamish Macbeth stood on the porch of the police station, his coat collar turned up against a wind that carried the stinging promise of sleet. He was nursing a lukewarm mug of coffee, staring out at the mist-choked mountains, when a distant, unnatural sound tore through the quiet. Not the roar of a tractor or the cry of a mountain bird, but the high, jagged shriek of a woman. It was a sound that made the morning air brittle. Lugs, standing at his feet, let out a low, mournful howl and bolted toward the track that led up to the Sterling estate. Hamish sighed, the sound echoing the resignation in his bones. He knew that sound. It was the sound of a world that had been carefully ordered and was now being unceremoniously dismantled. He set his coffee mug on the railing, checked his pockets to ensure he had his notebook and a spare packet of tobacco, and set out after the dog, his pace picking up despite the heavy, sodden ground beneath his boots. He reached the edge of the Sterling estate in record time, his lungs burning with the sharp, clean air. The gardens, usually a manicured tapestry of orderly colour, were a chaotic mess of overturned soil and uprooted shrubs. Mrs. Sterling was standing near the centre of a newly dug flower bed, her green coat splattered with dark, wet earth. Her hand was pressed to her mouth, her eyes fixed on something nestled within the mud. Hamish didn't rush. He approached with the slow, rhythmic gait of a man inspecting a fence line. He stepped over the low stone wall and moved toward her, his eyes scanning the scene with an intensity he kept carefully masked behind a veil of gormless distraction. It wasn't the missing gardener, Callum, who was lying in the dirt. It was something far more unexpected, a large, elaborate stone gargoyle, its head shattered into jagged fragments, and resting beneath the pile was a man's hand, rigid and grey, reaching out as if to claim the soil. "Good heavens, Mrs. Sterling," Hamish said, his voice slow and carefully devoid of alarm. "Looks like you've had a bit of an accident with the landscaping." Mrs. Sterling spun around, her face an ash-white mask of terror. "It's not an accident, you fool. Look." She pointed a trembling finger at the debris. Hamish knelt, his movements deliberate. He ignored her frantic agitation and focused on the scene. The body, or what could be seen of it, was not Callum's. It was an older man, dressed in the formal, stiff attire of a butler or an estate manager, his pockets turned inside out, and his neck at an angle that suggested a sudden, violent confrontation. This was no simple disappearance of a wayward gardener. This was a calculated, brutal termination. He didn't touch the body. He leaned close enough to catch the faint, lingering scent of lavender water and expensive, bitter almonds, a smell that had no business being here in the mud of a Glen garden. He looked up at Mrs. Sterling, who was now clutching her silver-headed walking stick, so hard her knuckles were white. "This isn't your gardener, is it, ma'am? Do you happen to know the gentleman?" "It's Mr. Henderson," she whispered, the words barely audible against the rising wind. "He was my late husband's solicitor. He arrived from London last night to discuss the estate. He said he had an urgent matter to settle. I told him to stay in the guest house. I didn't know. I didn't hear anything." Hamish stood up, his joints popping in the quiet. He looked around the estate, noting the tracks in the mud, too large for a gardener, too heavy for a solicitor, that led away from the flower bed and toward the dense, unforgiving woods of the glen. He felt the familiar, heavy weight of a case settling into his life. The peace of the morning was shattered, the orderly facade of the widow's life was in tatters, and he was, as usual, the one left to sort through the debris. He knew DCI Blair would be arriving within the hour, likely with enough noise to wake the dead. intent on pinning this on the most convenient person he could find. Hamish glanced at the shattered gargoyle, then back at the widow's frozen, terrified face. There was more to this than a simple robbery gone wrong. This was an interruption of a very specific, very dangerous kind. He reached out to Pat Luggs, who was sniffing cautiously at the solicitor's sleeve, and felt a surge of cold, focused determination. The widow was keeping secrets. The solicitor was silenced, and the murderer was still out there, hiding in the mist. He adjusted his cap, gave the scene a long, slow look, and began the long walk back to the road, to wait for the storm of police sirens that was undoubtedly on its way. His coffee was cold, his day was ruined, and he had a feeling that by nightfall, half the village would be wishing they hadn't seen a thing. Chapter 3. The arrival of the Strathbane police was not so much a formal investigative procedure as it was an atmospheric disturbance. A fleet of patrol cars, their sirens blaring with a frantic, piercing urgency that had no business disturbing the ancient quiet of Glen Torran, skidded into the Sterling estate, churning the already saturated mud into a soup of professional incompetence. Hamish, who had been leaning against a moss-covered stone wall, trying to project the image of a man whose primary contribution to the morning was simply occupying space, squinted as the lead car skidded to a halt. Out of the driver's side tumbled Detective Chief Inspector Blair, his face already a deep, mottled shade of crimson that deepened by the second as he surveyed the rain-swept chaos. He was a man whose career had been built on a foundation of aggressive volume and a complete lack of nuance. He marched toward Hamish, his heavy boots squelching in the mud, his features twisted into a look of preemptive disdain. "Macbeth," Blair bellowed, his voice carrying over the wind, "I am greeted by the news that a high-profile solicitor has been found, turned into garden fertilizer. And what do I find on arrival? You, standing here like a lump of wet granite. Do you have any idea how much pressure I am under to close this case before the press in London catches wind of it? It's a disgrace." Hamish allowed his posture to slump, letting his jaw hang slightly slack. "I was just waiting for you, sir. Thought it best not to disturb the scene until someone with your authority could direct the proceedings." Blair shoved past him, his team trailing behind him like a pack of nervous, overexcited hounds. "I'll bet you were. You've been waiting for me to do your work for you. Honestly, I don't know why we keep you on the payroll. You're a liability, a drain on resources, and a constant stain on the reputation of this department." He stormed toward the shattered gargoyle, his entourage scurrying to photograph the mud, the body, and the general scenery with a frantic energy that left Hamish cold. Blair paused over Mr. Henderson's body, his eyes sweeping the scene with a smug, satisfied glint. "It's obvious, isn't it? A simple robbery. The man arrived with documents, was intercepted by the gardener, and when the solicitor resisted, the gardener panicked and finished him off. It's the sort of impulsive, unrefined violence that characterizes the local labor force. Bring in the gardener. Where is he? Why hasn't he been detained?" "Callum isn't here, sir," Hamish interjected, his voice soft, almost timid. "Mrs. Sterling hasn't seen him since yesterday afternoon." "Then find him," Blair roared, turning on Hamish with a look of pure malice, "and stop offering excuses for his absence. It's clear to anyone with a functioning brain that the gardener is our man. He kills the solicitor, takes the documents, and flees. It's an open and shut case. You, Macbeth, are to stand aside. Do not interfere with my officers, do not speak to the witnesses, and do not, under any circumstances, try to conduct your own version of an investigation. You are completely, utterly sidelined." Blair's face was mere inches from Hamish's, his breath smelling faintly of stale coffee and unadulterated rage. He looked like he wanted nothing more than to peel the uniform right off Hamish's back. "If I find out you've been mooching around the village, asking questions, or trying to play the detective, I will personally ensure your transfer to the most remote, unpleasant traffic post in the lowlands. Do you understand me? You are here to follow instructions, not to think." "Yes, sir," Hamish murmured, looking down at his own muddied boots. "Good. Now, get out of my sight. Go back to your station and wait for further instructions." We are going to conduct a proper, professional, and efficient investigation. And I won't have your brand of gormless distraction muddying the water." Hamish didn't wait for a second invitation. He turned slowly, his walk a perfect, lumbering shuffle of a man who didn't care about anything, and began the long, cold trek back toward the village. Behind him, he could hear Blair's booming voice continuing to berate his team, ordering them to canvass the area and burn through the local witnesses with the subtlety of a wrecking ball. Hamish didn't feel the sting of the wind on his face. His mind was already moving away from the chaos of the estate. He knew Blair was wrong. He knew that the obvious suspect was exactly what the real killer was banking on. He felt a cool, sharp sense of purpose tightening in his chest. If Blair wanted him sidelined, he would let him be. That was the best way to ensure the real killer didn't suspect that the useless policeman was already on their trail. He had a few people to talk to, a few secrets to uncover, and absolutely no intention of following Blair's orders. Chapter 4. The village of Lochdubuff was a place where silence was merely a canvas upon which gossip was painted. By mid-afternoon, news of the Sterling estate murder had seeped into every kitchen and shop. Hamish, his coat still heavy with the damp of the morning, bypassed the main road, choosing instead the winding, overgrown paths that led toward the village centre. He had no intention of reporting to Blair. He had intentions of finding out exactly what had been hidden beneath the widow's well-manicured surface. His first stop was the tiny, cramped post office, a sanctuary of sorts where Elspeth, the postmistress, kept a running tally of everyone's business. She was behind the counter, her spectacles perched on the tip of her nose, peering at a pile of letters that seemed to grow of its own accord. "Hamish," she said, without looking up, "you're looking remarkably unbothered for a man whose jurisdiction just became the focus of a Strathbane circus. I suppose you're here to ask about the mail." Hamish leaned against the counter, letting his gaze drift toward a display of local honey. "Just checking in, Elspeth. You know how Blair gets? He needs his paperwork to feel like he's actually doing something. He's been asking after the gardener," she said, her voice dry as the winter heather. "Callum didn't just walk off. He's been receiving packages from a solicitor in Edinburgh, not Henderson. Someone else. Heavy, sealed envelopes. He's been keeping them behind the radiator in the back room of his cottage. I've seen him checking them every morning for the past week. He wasn't a gardener, Hamish. He was a caretaker, but not of petunias." Hamish felt the pieces clicking into place. Any idea what was in them? Documents, deeds, I'd wager. And a name kept appearing in the return address. The Torran Trust. It's an old, defunct holding company linked to the late Mr. Sterling. Callum wasn't working for the widow. He was working for someone who wanted to see her empire dismantled. Hamish thanked her, leaving a few coins for a tin of mince he didn't want, and walked back out into the mist. He headed straight for the small, fragrant curry shop owned by Mr. Patel. Patel was the best observer in the village. He sat by his front window for 12 hours a day and saw everything that walked, drove, or limped past his shop. Patel was busy grinding spices, the air thick with the scent of turmeric and cumin. He looked up as Hamish entered, his eyes shrewd and knowing. "The big police are running around like headless chickens. Constable, they've been to the hotel, the pier, and the pub. They are looking for a thief. They aren't looking for a ghost." "A ghost, Mr. Patel?" Hamish asked, picking up a bowl of steaming broth that Patel pushed toward him without a word. "Last night, before the rain turned to ice, I saw a car, a black sedan, very quiet, very expensive, parked near the edge of the Glen Woods. A man got out. He didn't walk toward the estate. He walked toward the old stone bridge. He wasn't looking for a garden. He was looking for a vantage point. He stayed there for 2 hours, watching the widow's house with binoculars. He had the look of a man who was waiting for a signal. Did you see his face?" "Only when the car lights swept across the road," Patel said, his voice dropping. "He had a scar running from his temple to his jaw, a very distinct mark. He didn't look like a local, and he certainly didn't look like an innocent passerby." Hamish finished the broth, his mind sharp and clear despite the facade of lethargy he maintained. The murder wasn't a robbery. It was a professional hit, executed by someone who had been watching the Sterling estate for days. Callum the gardener was clearly an informant, someone who had been feeding information about the widow's secrets to an outside party. And Henderson the solicitor had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He left the shop, the information settling in his chest like a cold weight. Blair was currently busy terrorizing a terrified gardener who hadn't even killed anyone, while the real killer was likely already preparing to move on. Convinced that the incompetent village policeman wouldn't even think to look beyond the obvious, Hamish felt a familiar, cold thrill. He had a name, the Torran Trust, and a description of a man with a scarred face. He didn't need forensics. He needed to start listening to the village, for in Lochdaviff, even the ghosts left footprints. He turned away from the main road, heading toward the quiet, mist-covered moors. He had a few more people to visit, and he intended to do it before Blair could cause any more damage to the investigation. Chapter 5. The evening air was thick, with the scent of pine and impending snow, when Hamish finally retreated to the dimly lit parlor of the local hotel. His heavy wool coat was damp through to the shoulders, and his fingers were numb from the biting wind. But his focus remained razor-sharp. He needed to speak with someone who understood the social intricacies of the Sterling family's circle. Someone whose status allowed her to see through the curtains that the widow kept so firmly drawn. Priscilla Halberton Smythe was waiting for him, seated in a velvet-upholstered armchair by the hearth, her attention fixed on a book she didn't seem to be reading. Her elegance was a stark contrast to the rough, unvarnished reality of the village murder. Yet her eyes held the same sharp, observant quality that Hamish had come to rely on. "You look as though you've been dragging your feet through half the bogs in the glen, Hamish," she said, closing her book with a soft, rhythmic snap. "And you have that look in your eyes, the one that suggests you've found something that Blair is too busy shouting to notice." Hamish slumped into the chair opposite her, letting out a long, weary breath. "It's not just a murder, Priscilla. It's a dismantling." Henderson wasn't just a solicitor. He was the keeper of a very expensive, very secret history. And the gardener was no gardener. He was a mole, digging up more than just roots. Priscilla leaned forward, her expression turning serious. "The Sterling estate has been a subject of speculation for years. When Elspeth Sterling married that financier, it wasn't a union of equals. It was a merger of two very different types of desperation. He needed her social legitimacy, and she needed his capital. If there was a Torran trust involved, it wouldn't have been a legitimate business. It would have been the repository for all the assets they had stripped from other people over the decades." "That fits with what I've learned," Hamish said, picking up the cup of tea she had already ordered for him. Someone wanted those records back. Someone with enough influence to hire a professional to watch the estate and enough audacity to silence anyone who stood in the way. Priscilla's gaze drifted toward the fire, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Hamish, you must be careful. If the Torran Trust is involved, you aren't just dealing with a murderer. You are dealing with people who have spent their lives erasing their own footsteps. If they send a man with a scarred face to watch the house, that man isn't just a guard, he's a liquidator." "I know," Hamish said, his voice soft, almost a murmur, "but they made a mistake. They assumed that a village like Lochdaviff was too small to be worth their time. And they assumed that a policeman like me was too slow to look at anything other than the obvious scapegoat." Priscilla stood, her movements graceful and fluid, and paced slowly toward the window, looking out at the dark, swirling mist that clung to the village. "There is one thing you haven't considered. The widow didn't just inherit an estate. She inherited a liability. If the gardener was stealing those records, she would have known. And if she knew, she would have had to make a choice, protect the memory of her husband or protect her own future." "You think she was in on it?" Hamish asked, his eyes narrowing. "I think she is terrified, Hamish. Not because of a murder, but because of what the murder might reveal if the wrong eyes look at it. If you want to find the killer, stop looking for the person who killed the solicitor. Start looking for the person who was afraid of what the solicitor was going to say to the authorities." Hamish felt the logic of her words settle into place, clear and cold. She was right. The widow wasn't just a victim. She was a participant in a high-stakes game that had suddenly turned lethal. The romantic complication of his life had once again provided the exact insight he had been missing. Priscilla saw the social dynamics, the desperation, the vanity, the cold, calculating preservation of status that he, for all his local knowledge, sometimes overlooked. He finished his tea, the warmth spreading through him and sharpening his resolve. He had enough information to bypass Blair entirely. He had a suspect, a motive, and a clear understanding of the web of greed that had resulted in a body being left in a flower bed. He stood up, feeling the weight of the moment, and offered Priscilla a small, appreciative nod. She understood him, perhaps better than he understood himself, and in a world where everyone was playing a part, her honesty was the one thing he could rely on. He left the hotel, the door closing behind him with a final, decisive click. The mist had begun to freeze on the ground, turning the village paths into treacherous, slick sheets of ice. He didn't care. He knew where he had to go, and he knew who he had to watch. The game was reaching its conclusion, and for the first time since the morning had started, Hamish felt like he was the one holding all the cards. The village was quiet, the mountains loomed in the dark, and somewhere in the shadows, the man with the scar was waiting for a signal that would never come. Chapter 6. The following morning brought a sky the color of a bruised, leaden coin, and a wind that seemed to howl with a personal vendetta against the village of Lochdavuth. Hamish Macbeth stood outside the police station, his hands deep in his pockets, watching the chaos of DCI Blair's operation, with the detachment of a man observing a particularly tedious play. Blair had spent the night in an apoplectic frenzy, badgering the local constabulary and terrifying the village's youth. He had officially declared Callum the gardener as the primary suspect, although the lad had been seen by 3 different witnesses miles away from the Stirling estate at the time of the murder. Blair walked toward Hamish, his face a vibrant, pulsating purple. "It's all settled, Macbeth. We have a witness who says he saw a man matching the gardener's description running toward the old bridge. It's an open and shut case. I'm preparing the arrest warrant now. Try not to trip over your own feet while I handle the real work." Hamish didn't look at him, his gaze fixed on a distant, snow-capped peak. "A witness, sir? That's remarkable. Most of the village has been locked inside their homes since the sleet began." "A detail," Blair roared, dismissive and impatient. "I don't need a lecture on meteorology from a man who spends his days poaching salmon. The case is closed. Stay out of the way, or I'll have your badge." Blair stomped off, his entourage trailing behind him with the exhausted, hollow-eyed look of men who had been awake for 24 hours and were no closer to the truth than they had been on day one. Hamish watched them go, his expression as vacant as a blank wall. He didn't care about Blair's fake witness. He had his own observation. Earlier that morning, he had slipped into the Stirling estate, bypassing the police perimeter with the ease of a man who knew every stone and shadow of the glen. He had walked to the old stone bridge that Patel had mentioned, the place where the man with the scarred face had been seen. He didn't find a gardener. Instead, tucked deep within the mortar of the bridge's underside, he found a discarded raincoat. Heavy, expensive wool, and utterly out of place for a common labourer. Inside the pocket was not a weapon or a stolen document, but a set of keys, each one labelled with a room number from the local hotel and a small, gold-embossed calling card that belonged to none other than the widow's own lawyer, a man who had visited the estate just days prior to the solicitor's arrival. Hamish turned the keys over in his hand, his mind re-evaluating the entire tapestry of the crime. The gardener was a red herring, a convenient distraction, manufactured by someone who knew how Blair's mind worked. The real killer wasn't some desperate labourer trying to protect his livelihood. The real killer was someone who moved in the same social circles as the widow, someone who had planned the murder with a cold, calculating efficiency that relied on everyone blaming the unrefined local. He walked back toward the village, his stride long and deliberate. He had been looking for a hired liquidator, but he had found something far more complex, an internal betrayal. The widow wasn't just afraid of the documents. She was being systematically squeezed by her own legal counsel, who had clearly been orchestrating the disappearance of the late Mr. Stirling's assets, long before anyone else had arrived on the scene. The gardener hadn't been an accomplice. He had been the only one who actually witnessed the lawyer tampering with the estate records, which was why he had been forced to vanish. Blair was chasing a shadow, and in doing so, he was ensuring that the person who truly held the knife remained invisible. Hamish felt the cool, sharp clarity of the truth settle in his mind. He didn't need to arrest the gardener. He needed to expose the lawyer. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of the hotel keys. He knew exactly where the lawyer was staying, and he knew exactly what he would find if he searched those rooms. He didn't need forensics. He didn't need the grand, posturing authority of Strathbane. He had the evidence, he had the context, and he knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones, that the killer was still here, hiding in the safety of the hotel, waiting for the police to finish their fruitless hunt for the gardener. He turned toward the village centre, his expression hardening. He had been playing the fool, letting Blair have his moment of glory. But that moment was coming to an end. It was time to stop watching the play and start directing the finale. He had a trap to set, and he was going to make sure that when it snapped shut, it didn't just catch the killer. It exposed the entire rotten foundation of the Sterling estate's secrets. The wind bit harder, but Hamish didn't feel it. He was already thinking about his next move, his eyes fixed on the hotel door. Chapter 7. The cold, biting wind, whipping down from the peaks of Glen Torran, carried with it the scent of wet heather and the undeniable metallic tang of deceit. Hamish Macbeth stood in the shadow of the local hotel, his hands deep in the pockets of his regulation greatcoat, watching the warm glow of the windows with a sense of grim, detached satisfaction. He now understood that the murder at the Sterling estate was not born of sudden, heat-of-the-moment rage, nor was it the desperate act of a man trying to protect his livelihood. It was something far more clinical, far colder, and deeply rooted in the insidious greed of the professional elite. The keys he had recovered from beneath the old stone bridge were the final, crucial component in a puzzle that had been meticulously constructed over the course of years. The lawyer, a man named Sterling Vane, was not merely a legal advisor to the widow. He was the architect of an elaborate, multi-layered fraud. The Torran Trust was a shell, a hollow vessel used to funnel the estate's liquid assets into offshore accounts under the guise of rehabilitation projects and historical preservation. The solicitor, Henderson, had stumbled upon the discrepancy during a routine audit, and the gardener, Callum, had been the one who had actually seen Sterling Vane transferring the physical ledgers out of the house. The motive was not just financial gain. It was the total preservation of a lifestyle built on the wreckage of other people's fortunes. Sterling Vane had been living on the brink of exposure, and he had been willing to kill anyone, solicitor or gardener, to ensure his facade remained intact. The scarred man Patel had seen was not a professional liquidator hired to clean up a mess. He was a private security operative, Sterling. Vane had employed to monitor the estate and intimidate anyone who got too close to the truth. The murder was a calculated, cold-blooded resolution to a business problem. Hamish felt a surge of cold, dry irony. The widow, Elspeth Sterling, was not an accomplice in the traditional sense, but she was certainly a willing beneficiary of the deception, choosing to look the other way while her estate was systematically hollowed out because she preferred the luxury of ignorance over the hardship of truth. She was as culpable in her own way as the man who held the knife. They were all players in a high-stakes, hollow game, treating human lives as nothing more than variables in their own personal balance sheets. It was an intrusion of the worst kind, a stain on the quietude of Lockdove that he felt a sudden, fierce need to scrub away. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had seen something ugly and wanted it gone. He pulled the hotel key from his pocket, the metal cold against his palm. He knew Sterling. Vane was in room 204. He knew that if he searched that room, he would find the proof of the fraud, the original ledgers, the transfer documents, and the damning correspondence between the lawyer and the security operative. The village was quiet. The only sound, the mournful, rhythmic tapping of a loose shutter against a wooden wall. He realized that the village of Lockduff was never meant to be the stage for such a cold, calculated drama. The Highlands cared nothing for their hollow histories or their stolen treasures. Yet here they were, bringing their city darkness into his home, demanding he witness their petty, vicious war. He felt a sudden, sharp spike of resolve. He was no longer just a policeman who wanted his peace back. He was the only thing standing between these scavengers and their complete, untethered dominance. He turned toward the hotel entrance, his pace quickening, his movements sharp and purposeful. He was going to end this. Not for the promotion, not for the glory, and certainly not for DCI Blair. He was going to end it because the peace of his home had been violated, and he was the only one who truly cared enough to set things right. He didn't need forensics or high-tech labs. He had the evidence, he had the context, and he knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones, that the killer was still inside, waiting for the storm to die down so he could finally escape. He was the fool of Lockduff. But tonight, he was the architect of his own, very necessary and very final confrontation. The trap was ready, and he intended to spring it with the precision of a man who had nothing to lose and everything to protect. Chapter 8. The atmosphere inside the hotel was stifling, thick, with the smell of roasting venison and the damp, cloying scent of woolen coats drying by the hearth. Hamish pushed through the door, the bell above his head offering a sharp, metallic announcement of his arrival that made the few patrons in the lounge look up. He didn't look toward the bar. His eyes went straight to the corner table where Sterling Vane sat, nursing a glass of dark brandy and studying a stack of papers with the focus of a man who believed he was untouchable. Hamish walked over, his gait the familiar, shuffling slouch of a man with nowhere better to be. He pulled out the chair opposite the lawyer without asking, letting his greatcoat puddle on the floor. Sterling Vane looked up, his expression one of refined, aristocratic annoyance. He took in Hamish's muddy boots and disheveled appearance with a sneer that was clearly intended to dismiss him entirely. "I believe you're mistaken, officer," Sterling Vane said, his voice as smooth and cold as polished marble. "This table is occupied, and I am in the middle of some very sensitive estate business. I suggest you find another corner to occupy." "Estate business?" Hamish repeated, his voice a slow Highland drawl. "Must be complicated. What with the solicitor ending up face down in the petunias. That's the sort of business that usually requires a bit of legal clarification, I'd imagine." Sterling Vane stiffened, though his eyes remained chillingly steady. "A tragedy, certainly, but it hardly concerns me. The police have their suspect in the gardener, and I'm sure DCI Blair will have this all wrapped up by morning. Now, unless you have an actual reason for this intrusion, I would appreciate a bit of privacy." Hamish didn't move. He reached into his pocket and slowly pulled out the set of hotel keys he had recovered from the bridge. He laid them on the table, the metallic clatter sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. "I found these, Mr. Sterling Vane. A strange place for them, don't you think? Tucked away under a bridge, waiting for a man who wasn't there." The lawyer's composure didn't crack, but the silence between them deepened, becoming brittle. He stared at the keys, his lips thinning. "I have no idea what those are. Perhaps you should return them to the lost and found. You're becoming quite a nuisance, Macbeth. I've already spoken with the chief superintendent in Strathbane regarding your behavior. I imagine your transfer to a desk in the city will be processed before the week is out." "Aye, that might be," Hamish said, leaning forward, his eyes suddenly bright and piercing beneath his heavy, lowered brows. "But I've been doing a bit of reading, you see, about the Torran Trust. It's a fascinating story. All those assets, all those names. Henderson had quite a detailed ledger. It's a pity he didn't get to finish his audit before someone decided he needed to be retired." Sterling Vane laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "You have nothing, a set of keys and a theory. You're playing a very dangerous game, Constable. People who meddle in things they don't understand tend to find themselves at the bottom of a lock. Or perhaps simply gone, like your gardener friend. Is that a fact?" Hamish mused, his hand moving to his other pocket. He pulled out the gold-embossed calling card, sliding it across the table until it rested against the lawyer's brandy glass. "You know, the man with the scar, the one who was watching the house from the bridge? He left a lot behind. Not just a raincoat, He was quite chatty in his own way. "He seems to think you're not the type to pay your debts to the people who do your dirty work." The lawyer's hand shook, just once, as he reached for the glass. The room air seemed thin. He realized then that the gormless policeman hadn't just stumbled onto the keys. He had systematically unraveled the entire operation. Hamish wasn't bluffing. He had the connection, he had the motive, and he had made it clear that the lawyer was no longer the one inches controlled. "I'm going to walk out that door," Hamish said, standing up, his frame suddenly towering, his presence no longer the sleepy, slouching Bobby, but something far more formidable. "I'm going to go to the station and call the authorities in Edinburgh, not Strathbane, mind you, but the real ones. The ones who know how to look at financial ledgers. By the time I get back, I'd suggest you be ready to explain exactly why your keys were found at the scene of a murder. I've a feeling it's going to be a very long night for you." Hamish turned and walked away, his heart pounding his ribs like a trapped bird. He had set the trap, and he knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones, that Sterling Vane wouldn't wait for the morning. The lawyer would try to run, try to destroy the final traces of his fraud. In his panic, he would reveal exactly what he had done. The room remained deathly still as Hamish exited into the freezing night, leaving the lawyer alone with the cold reality of his own undoing. The trap was set, and the game was finally nearing its end. Chapter 9. The sleet had intensified into a biting, horizontal blizzard. By the time Hamish reached the edge of the Sterling estate, he wasn't heading to the main house. He was making for the old carriage shed, a structure that had been used by the late Mr. Sterling to store antique vehicles, and, as Hamish suspected, the final pieces of the ledger trail that had cost two men their lives. The air was so cold it burned, and the wind shrieked through the trees, a primal, haunting sound that served as a fitting backdrop for the night's end. He stood in the darkness, his breath blooming before him like a ghost, listening. He didn't have to wait long. A pair of headlights cut through the swirling snow, the engine of the lawyer's car snarling as it navigated the treacherous icy track toward the shed. Sterling Vane wasn't running away. He was coming here to finalize the destruction of his evidence. He stepped out of the vehicle, his silhouette sharp against the blinding white of the snow, a heavy bag in one hand and a petrol canister in the other. He moved with a frantic, jerky speed, the poise of the sophisticated legal counsel having completely evaporated in the face of his own impending ruin. Hamish stepped out from behind the trunk of a massive, ancient oak, his presence silent and sudden. "It's a long way to come, just for a bit of gardening, Mr. Sterling Vane." The lawyer spun around, the petrol canister slipping from his grasp and spilling a dark, acrid pool onto the snow. He didn't look like an aristocrat anymore. He looked like a man who had finally seen the shadow of his own actions. "You," he spat, his voice trembling with a mix of exhaustion and genuine terror. "You don't know what you're doing. You're destroying a legacy for the sake of a gardener and a solicitor who wouldn't have even mattered in a year. Get out of my way." "They mattered to their families," Hamish said, his voice quiet, calm, and utterly immovable. "And they matter to the law. You've spent your life thinking that you could buy your way out of the consequences of your own greed. But the Highlands have a funny way of settling debts that money can't reach." Sterling Vane surged forward, his hand diving into the pocket of his coat. He wasn't reaching for a ledger. He was pulling a small, snub-nosed pistol, a weapon that looked entirely incongruous in his manicured hand. "I'm not going to prison because of a village policeman with no prospects. You've pushed this too far, Macbeth. It's over." Hamish didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't even raise his hands. He stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on the lawyer's. "You aren't a murderer, Sterling Vane. You're a lawyer. You spend your life hiding behind words and loopholes. If you pull that trigger, you'll never find your way out of the hole you've dug. And the people you work for, who sent the man with the scar, they'll see you as a loose end, just like Henderson." "Put the gun down." The lawyer hesitated, his hand shaking so violently that the barrel of the pistol wavered wildly. It was that moment of indecision, that split second, where his training as a man of law fought with the animal panic of a trapped creature, that Hamish exploited. He moved with the sudden, violent grace he kept hidden beneath his slouch, closing the distance between them before Sterling. Vane could even blink. He didn't strike to injure, he struck to disarm. His hand clamped over the lawyer's wrist, twisting with a sharp, controlled motion that sent the pistol flying into the deep snow. A swift, firm shove followed, sending Sterling Vane stumbling backward until he collided with the rough, frozen wood of the carriage shed, where Hamish pinned him against the wall with a firm, inescapable grip on his coat. The lawyer gasped, his face pressed against the rough timber, his body going limp as the reality of his defeat finally crystallized. He wasn't a master of the universe. He was a man caught in the cold, dark grip of the Highland night, waiting for a justice he had spent his life pretending didn't exist. The blizzard continued to howl, covering the traces of their struggle, the snow already beginning to bury the dropped gun and the spilled petrol. "It's over," Hamish repeated, his voice barely audible over the gale, but it carried the weight of an absolute final verdict. There are no more loopholes, and there is no more Sterling Vane legacy. There is only the truth of what you did in that garden. The confrontation was messy, as all things involving true desperation were. But it was effective. As he stood there, pinning the architect of the Sterling estate's downfall against the shed, Hamish felt a strange sense of clarity. The village of Lockdove would survive this, just as it had survived everything else. He pulled his radio from his belt, his thumb hitting the transmitter, and called the station in Strathbane, his voice steady, tired, and profoundly, irrevocably relieved. The game was finished, the trap had worked, and for the first time in days, the air felt lighter, despite the crushing cold of the storm. He had won, but more importantly, he had ensured that the dark history of the Sterling estate would finally, mercifully, come to a close. Chapter 10. The following morning was one of those rare, crystalline days in Lockdove, when the sun reflected off the fresh snowfall with such brilliance that one had to squint to see the path ahead. Hamish Macbeth stood in the doorway of his small police station, nursing a mug of tea that was mercifully hot, watching the arrival of the Strathbane authorities. DCI Blair's car led the procession, its tires crunching rhythmically against the icy gravel. Behind him came the official transport vehicle meant for Sterling Vane, who was now securely bound and sitting in the back of a squad car, looking every inch the shattered ruin of a man. Blair stepped out of his vehicle, his face a complex mosaic of triumph and irritation. He had spent the previous night being briefed on the arrest, a process that Hamish had carefully managed to ensure the official report mirrored Blair's own inflated sense of importance. In the documents submitted to headquarters, the cunning trap, the meticulous tracking of evidence, and the heroic final confrontation were attributed to the strategic oversight of the Strathbane detective force. Hamish had been careful to frame his own involvement as merely securing the area and providing local assistance, while Blair directed the operation from his command post. Blair stomped toward Hamish, his eyes scanning the surrounding hills as if he were taking ownership of the entire glen. "Macbeth, I've read your report. It's concise, I'll give you that. You seem to have finally learned how to present the facts without adding your own unnecessary commentary. It's a pity it took a murder of this magnitude to drill it into you, but the result is satisfactory." Hamish nodded, his shoulders slumping into that familiar defeated posture that always seemed to irritate the DCII. "Aye, sir. It was a complex business, the sort that really benefits from a more seasoned hand. I'm just glad the force could resolve it so quickly. It's a credit to your leadership, sir, really." Blair puffed out his chest, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his thin lips. "Quite right, quite right. It was a textbook execution of police protocol. I've already drafted a commendation for the Strathbane team, and I've made sure to mention that local support was adequate." He looked at Hamish with a mixture of suspicion and grudging respect, as if he couldn't quite figure out how the lazy Bobby had managed to avoid fouling up the entire investigation. "You'll be staying here then. I've recommended against your transfer. Not because you've earned a reward, mind you, but because you clearly lack the ambition for city work. You're a small-town man for a small-town station, and that's where you belong." Hamish felt the tension drain from his shoulders. The threat of being uprooted, of being sent to a cramped, impersonal city station, had been the only shadow hanging over his peace. By handing Blair the glory, he had effectively cemented his tenure in Lockduff. "I'm grateful for your confidence in my limitations, Sir," Hamish said, his voice as dull and flat as the winter sea. "It's a relief to know I can keep on doing the job I'm used to." "Just don't get comfortable," Blair barked, turning toward his car. "I'll be watching. One more slip-up, one more unauthorized investigation, and you're finished. Is that clear?" "Perfectly, sir," Hamish replied, watching the squad cars begin to pull away as the last vehicle disappeared around the bend, leaving the quiet of the village to descend once more. Hamish let out a long, slow breath. The credits had shifted. The narrative was rewritten to suit the ego of his superior, and he was left with exactly what he wanted. A quiet life in a quiet place. He didn't care that his colleagues in the city would read the report and assume he was a man of limited faculties who had simply been in the right place at the right time. He didn't care about the commendations, the headlines, or the praise of the department. He had saved the village from a darkness it didn't deserve, and he had preserved the only life he ever cared to live. He turned back into the station, the warmth of the stove greeting him like an old friend. He sat down at the table, reached for his tobacco, and felt the weight of the last few days dissolve into the stillness of the room. The case was closed, the ledger was balanced, and for the first time in an eternity, there was nothing to do but sit, drink his tea, and listen to the wind outside. He was the constable of Lochdubuff, and for now, the world was exactly as it ought to be. Chapter 11. The aftermath of a village mystery in Lochduv always felt like the settling of sediment in a disturbed loch. Once the sirens faded into the distance and the intrusive shadow of Strathbane's authority had retreated, the village did not offer applause. It simply absorbed the event back into the fabric of its daily rhythm. The snow continued to fall, a soft, relentless white blanket that erased the tire tracks and the trampled mud of the Stirling estate, effectively scrubbing the crime from the physical landscape. Hamish, standing on the threshold of his police station, felt a profound, almost tectonic sense of relief as the silence of the mountains reclaimed the valley. He walked down toward the water's edge, his boots crunching rhythmically on the hardened crust of the snow. The loch was a sheet of obsidian, cold and still, reflecting the pale, distant light of the winter stars. He had spent the last several days living on the razor's edge of exposure, juggling the demands of an arrogant boss, the lies of a desperate widow, and the cold, calculated violence of a man who viewed people as assets to be liquidated. Now, with the lawyer in custody and the evidence safely in the possession of the real authorities, the weight that had been pressing against his ribs began to dissipate. He pulled his pipe from his pocket, the ritual of tamping and lighting it grounding him in the present moment. As he walked, he passed the village hotel. The windows were warm, glowing with the inviting yellow light of a fire. He could hear the muffled, familiar cadence of his neighbors discussing the weather, the upcoming spring, and the price of wool. They were talking about mundane things, the things that actually mattered in a place like Lochdubuff. The murder, for all its drama, was already being relegated to the status of a long winter tale, a piece of gossip that would be embellished over pints for years to come, but which held no power over their actual lives. Hamish felt a surge of genuine affection for them. They were simple, stubborn, and wonderfully unbothered by the grand ambitions of the outside world. He reached the jetty, where the small fishing boats were bobbing gently against the ice-rimmed pier. Lugs, who had been padding along silently at his heels, let out a sharp, inquisitive bark and chased a gull that had landed on the pier. Hamish watched them, a small, tired smile softening his features. He had no desire for recognition. He had no desire to be the man who saved the estate or the man who brought down the Torran Trust. He only wanted to be the man who walked his dog, drank his coffee, and ensured that the village remained the kind of place where a murder was a rare, shocking anomaly rather than a recurring fact of life. When he finally returned to the station, the room felt warmer, more intimate. He fed the stove with another scuttle of coal, watching the flames lick greedily at the fresh fuel. He sat at his table, the wood scarred and stained by years of service, and pulled out his favorite book, something simple, something old, and entirely devoid of mysteries. He was finished with mysteries. He had spent enough time peering into the dark corners of the human heart to last a lifetime. He poured the last of his tea, the steam curling into the cool air of the office, and leaned back, stretching his long, aching legs toward the heat. The night was truly his now. There were no more files to compile for DCI Blair, no more lies to dissect, and no more killers to track through the frozen woods. The Lochda village was safe and he was home, as the wind continued to howl outside. No longer an angry creditor, but a familiar, nocturnal companion. Hamish felt a deep, resonant calm settle in his chest. He was the constable, the guardian of the quiet, and he was content to spend the rest of his days ensuring that the peace he had protected remained unbothered. He turned a page of his book. The sound was small and crisp in the quiet room, and for the first time in ages, he didn't hear a knock at the door. He simply listened to the fire, the ticking of the clock, and the steady, rhythmic breathing of his dog. It was enough. It had always been enough. The case of the Sterling estate was over, the ledger of his life was balanced, and the long, cold night was, at last, entirely at peace.